Monster. When you hear that word, what comes to mind? My guess is that it would be something grotesque. Even more likely, something that isn't human. But that's wrong. Monsters aren't something of fiction. But they also aren't the thing you imagine. In fact, you are living among them without so much as a thought. The things that are the real monsters are humans. I moved into a rural town last month. My mother and father had both gotten into a car accident, and I needed to get away from all the memories of town. But that's besides the point. I had just gotten settled down into my small house when I decided to go say hi to my new neighbours. It was a rural town, so there weren't very many people, about 300 or so, and I figured I might as well get acquainted with a few of them. I stepped outside, and for the first time, realised the horrible, rancid smell. It appeared to be coming from the garage that the people next door owned, and as I got closer, it grew stronger. I persevered, covering my nose the best I could, and approached the door, knocking on it, and quickly uncovering my nose, trying to breathe through only my mouth. A little old lady answered the door, and I forced a smile, still trying to ignore the odour. "Hello, I'm your new neighbour." I held out my hand for her to shake, and she took it. I suppressed a shudder. Her hand felt leathery and calloused. "Hello, dear. My name is Ophelia. It's nice to have new neighbours. There hasn't been anyone in that house for a long time." Her thin lips stretched into a saggy smile, and I winced, seeing what little teeth she had left. "I just wanted to ask you why your garage smells so strange. Did you need help cleaning anything out of it? I'd be happy to offer my services." "I would love that, you handsome young man. I could use some muscle. There's a dead raccoon in there, and it's stuck behind a shelf that I can't move. How about tomorrow afternoon? I'll make you some lunch, and you can get the raccoon out of my garage." I nodded, and exchanged a few more words with her before leaving, nauseous, but glad I was going to be able to get rid of the smell the next day. I walked over to her house and found her sitting on her porch in a wicker rocking chair. She gestured to the other seat and offered me a glass of lemonade, which I thought was weird, considering I hadn't even started working, but I accepted the drink. She talked with me for a bit, and I began feeling a little tired. I figured it was just the day's heat and stood up. "I'm going to go get that raccoon out for you now, miss." I pulled out a pair of rubber gloves from my pocket and unfolded the plastic trash bag. She also stood up and pulled a pair of keys out of her pocket. She then ushered me down the porch steps before following after me, her step a slow, frail hobble. As she unlocked the door for me, I grew dizzy. It wasn't until then that I realised something was wrong. She opened the door for me, and I was about to open my mouth to speak, when I felt a weak shove from behind and fell to the ground inside of the garage with a sickening thud. The door was slammed behind me, and I scrambled as best as I could to open it, but she had already locked it. It was only a matter of moments before I passed out. It wasn't even enough time for my eyes to adjust, and I'm almost glad they didn't. When I opened my eyes next, I was being moved. My eyes were bleary, and my senses low, but once I felt the zip ties closing around my wrists, I remembered what had happened before I passed out. I felt someone's breath on my neck as the zip ties were still being tightened, and in self-defense I swung my head back as hard as I could, feeling the back of my skull make contact with someone's face, hearing a loud crack and a yelp. Whoever it was let me go, giving me time to scramble away. My hands were tied tight, enough that if I wanted to get them out, I'd have to severely injure my wrists. I looked at my captor in shock. It was Ophelia. Her hands over her bleeding broken nose, her eyes full of malice and a scowling frown. It wasn't until then that I took the time to look around. There were bodies everywhere. Some were hung from meat hooks that dangled off the ceiling, while others carelessly lay on the ground. Some of them had chunks missing, and the smell was even worse inside of the garage, heaving at the sight and smell of the mangled, dripping bodies around the room. Ophelia was on her feet now, and advancing on me with a large meat cleaver, and I knew if I didn't act, I would soon be strung up like the others. I managed to get up without using my hands, and backed up against the wall, trying not to slip on the streaks of still wet blood, or fall over any of the scattered limbs and torsos. As she approached, I kicked her hard in the stomach, causing her to fall backwards, and she hit her head on the concrete floor, hard, knocking her out. The meat cleaver in her hands clattered to the ground. I ran over to the door and began throwing my entire body weight against it, hurting my shoulder in the process, but finally breaking it open. Once I was free from that hell, I ran as fast as I could to the next house over, screaming for someone to call the police on my way there. The neighbour must have heard, because once I reached her door, she was outside, the phone in her hand, talking to the police. I told her what happened. I told her about seemingly innocent little Ophelia, and her garage as she cut the zip ties away from my wrists. Trying to describe it out loud almost made me vomit again. Once the police arrived, she was kind enough to explain it for me. Seeing the distressed look on my face, they found her alive, with a cracked head. They had found 20 people in that garage. All of them had been identified as missing people. Inside the house, they found large freezers that contained more chunks of meat, all human. Ophelia had been a cannibal and confessed to killing 50 people, but I suspect there were more. She was sent to prison for the rest of her life.
When I was younger, my parents were always busy. My mom had 2 jobs and my dad had just the one that kept him incredibly busy. So of course I went to daycare. I really did love it, and so did all the other kids. The daycare guy's name was Darren, and he was really good with kids. He made you feel special. Just by looking at him, you knew he was a kind person. And if you squinted, you could mistake him for Santa Claus. It was the best daycare in the area, and there wasn't much competition. My favorite part of daycare by far was the s'mores. Every other night we would sit around the fire and eat s'mores. I remember specifically that we would put sprinkles on our s'mores, which seems weird but was great. Sometimes Darren would tell scary stories, but they were never too scary, seeing as it was a daycare. Everybody enjoyed them. It's always fun to be scared together. It's funny to think those stories used to scare me. When you're young, your innocence masks the true evils of the world. I went to that same daycare for about 1.5 years. Couldn't have been happier. Liking it as much as I did made it a sad day when my mom told me that I would not be going there anymore. I remember my mom looking very sad when she told me this. Not sad like she missed her favorite show, not sad like she had a bad day, but deeply depressed. When I asked why, she just told me that Darren was moving. She never went out as much after that. She never was as happy in general after that. Time after time as I got older, I would ride my bike past Darren's old house, and every time I did, I was reminded of all those good times. More time passed, and when I turned 18, I moved out of my house. I visited home quite often, and liked to reminisce about my childhood. One day I visited home as usual, but after the usual chit-chat with my mom, she said she wanted to tell me something. A tear was shed as she started talking, and I became worried. She continued to tell me that it was about my old daycare. This surprised me as I had forgotten all about it. What about that daycare that I loved so much could have made my mom cry? She told me something that almost made me vomit. She told me the reason I stopped going there. Darren, the man I had looked up to, was a monster. A child's body was found in his cellar with multiple limbs missing. But even more disturbing is the reason behind it. It was found that Darren was a cannibal. He specifically enjoyed human bones and would crush them up and use them as food toppings. The sprinkles on those s'mores were not sprinkles. I don't go out much anymore. I'm not as happy, in general, anymore.
This story takes place in the forest behind my house. It was an average sunny Saturday, and I decided to go for a stroll down some of the old fire trails behind my house. This was majorly out of character for me. Usually, I would be glued to my computer screen over the weekends, binging Netflix and CSGO with my trusty bag of potato chips. But luckily, there had been a storm last night which took out one of the power lines and severed our internet connection. So now I had a good excuse to get some much needed exercise, as exclaimed by my mother. I was hesitant at first, trying every possible solution to get our internet back. I called up our internet provider, and they said it could take up to 6 days before we got our internet back. So it was either do something outside, or play with my little sister in her dollhouse. So yeah, the great outdoors it was. I stormed out my back door and into the thick green forest. Despite my unenthusiastic attitude for walking, I did eventually start enjoying myself. Mildly. It was a long fire trail that stopped at a stream. I had fun jumping over rocks and skipping stones, so this is where I spent most of my time over the next 6 days. It was a good hour-and-a-half walk to the stream, depending on how fast I walked, and I never went further than the stream, since there were no clear indicators that any trails were past the stream, and since navigation isn't my strong suit, I wasn't looking to get lost. Something I should mention, not once did I see any signs of life while walking on the fire trail. No people, no birds. Hell, besides the stream, the entire forest seemed eerily quiet. On the 4th day, I got to the stream at about noon. At first, it seemed like another ordinary day, until I noticed a bunch of different sized pots and pans lying on the far side of the stream, directly across from me, seemingly by themselves for no reason whatsoever. I then thought, well, maybe someone is washing them, but why would they come all the way down to this stream to do their washing, unless they lived out here? I found that hard to believe, considering how isolated it was. But either way, whoever they belonged to, I'm sure they were bound to come back and finish the job, so I moved further up the stream. The rest of the day went without incident. On the 6th day, however, I had a feeling of dread while approaching the stream. As I got to the stream, this feeling of dread intensified. There was just something odd about those rust-covered pots and pans that put me at unease, which led me to again move further up the stream from where I saw the pots and pans. I didn't want to run the risk of an awkward encounter with some hillbilly living in the middle of nowhere. Well, maybe less awkward, and more like the plot of a horror movie. I went considerably far up the stream this time. I figured it was the last day until our internet came back, and I wanted to see what was further up the stream. After walking for 10 or so minutes, I eventually ended up spotting the rest of the fire trail, continuing on the other side of the stream. So it appeared at first. I decided I'd follow it for another 10 or so minutes, then head home. As I went deeper and deeper through the fire trail, it started to get considerably narrow. and it soon became clear to me that this was not the rest of the fire trail. I went to turn back when I caught a glimpse of something from the corner of my eye. A building of some sort. What the hell is a building doing all the way out here? Maybe it was one of those outposts that firemen use. I quickly dismissed that thought as I got closer to it. It appeared to be some sort of cabin. My next thought was, perhaps it belonged to whoever was washing those pots and pans a few days earlier. As I was scoping out the cabin, I felt a cool breeze hit my skin. I then heard what appeared to be a gentle clackling sound from something above me. As I looked up, I saw what was making the clackling sound. What it appeared to be was bones tied together with string, creating what I can only describe as a makeshift wind chime. This freaked me the hell out, and I stood there watching for any movement from the cabin. It, like the forest, was dead silent. There was also a wooden chair out the front of the cabin. Sitting on the chair was what looked to be binoculars and rope sitting atop a couple magazines that were also placed on top of the chair. Again, I heard the clackle of the wind chime, and my heart started beating like crazy. I knew I needed to get the hell out of here. I turned around and sprinted in the direction I'd come from. To my dismay, I ended up tripping and falling over, badly hurting my leg. My clumsiness probably due to all the adrenaline that had just been pumped into me. Despite being in pain, I jolted up and continued running. I quickly found the stream and followed it down towards the fire trail. Once I found the trail, I sprinted on it for as long as my legs allowed me to, which was probably only 10 minutes. Once I felt like my legs were going to give out, I stopped to catch my breath, feeling safer now that I had made some distance between me and the cabin. I checked my phone to see if I had any bars of reception. As I was doing this, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I kept my head down, not wanting to draw attention to the fact I'd seen whoever this was who was watching me. My mind was racing, and as I lowered my phone, ready to take off down the trail, that's when I saw it. Under the leaves, barely visible on the trail due to the noticeable rust which camouflaged it amongst the dirt. A bear trap. A goddamn bear trap. That's when I turned my attention to the movement I'd seen earlier. There, behind a tree, stood a man of average height, filthy dark curly hair, holding some sort of sharp object, along with a dirty rag and a small rucksack. He was looking at the bear trap, almost as intently as he was looking at me, as if he was just waiting for the moment I stood on it, and the jaws slammed into my flesh. His eyes were wide open, and I swear I saw him licking his lips. Finally, my legs kicked into gear, and I flew over the bear trap and ran as fast as I could, back along the trail towards my house. Luckily, to my knowledge, he didn't appear to have followed me. I made it home in a quarter of the time it would take me to get to the stream. I bursted through my door huffing and puffing. The commotion I caused made my father come rushing down the stairs, and after I relayed what had happened to me for the next 20 or so minutes, and begging them to get the police involved, they eventually caved and made the call. Unfortunately, it took the police the next day to investigate, since it wasn't deemed an emergency. They came to our house later that afternoon, telling us they found the cabin, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years, and there were no signs that anyone had actually been there. Though they did find the wind chime I described to them, and some old pots and pans half buried on the bank of the stream. They said they couldn't do much else, since the person hadn't technically done anything illegal. However, a couple weeks went by, and they ended up returning to our house with some follow-up questions. I answered them all, to the best of my memory, and asked them if there had been any further developments. Their faces turned white as they told me, after running the bones of the wind chime through forensics, they discovered that the bones from the wind chime were human, and that numerous human follicles and flesh fragments were found on the base of the cooking pans found near the stream. After returning to the cabin once again, they found numerous cooking books from the 1980s, meat hooks, knives, and other utensils of that nature in a large barrel about 50 meters away from the cabin. Unfortunately, I have no doubt in my mind that on that day I came face to face with a real-life cannibal.
I haven't always lived in backwoods Georgia. I was born and raised in Austin, then moved to Georgia with my father and stepmom when I turned 18. This story takes place in the marshland of Savannah. My dad is a huge outdoors freak. He was an Eagle Scout as a boy, and for as long as I can remember, he has taught me how to fish, swim, and generally handle the wilds. One June day, we decided to go crabbing. We loaded up on bait and drove off. Our usual spot was a pond near a reserve. Today, though, my dad wanted to try a new spot. It was a small river against which edged a park. I felt the place would be too disturbed to go crabbing, but lo and behold, on our first cast out we caught a crab. These things were fearless. Those of you who have been crabbing will know that this is unusual. If those biters even see the shadow of a net, they scuttle off. These crabs didn't. I had my toes snapped at more times than I can count. Time drew on. We were hitting the jackpot with this place. Already we had a dozen huge crabs in the bucket. But something felt off. That little sense I had told me to toss the crabs back, to leave that place, and that crabbing there was wrong. I voiced my concerns to my father, who flat out refused to leave. We'd never been so lucky at the pond, so we stayed until dusk, then left with our catch. I was somewhat proud of a monster I had caught with my hands, a whopping 8-inch, 2-pound beast of a crab. It fearlessly snapped at my hands and arms the whole time I dealt with it. Once home, we cooked and shelled the things, scooped out the meat and prepared it. My stepmom made crab cakes, which we would serve the next day during a barbecue. This was at my request. I had a feeling those cakes were not meant to be touched, much the same way I felt about Taco Bell's breakfast burrito when my uncle brought over one day for me to enjoy. This proved to be true. That burrito made me violently ill. Anyway, shortly before my dad is due to return home from work the next day, I get a call from him. He's hysterical, screaming about those damn crab cakes. I asked him to calm down and enunciate. Watch the news and don't eat a fucking cake. Vomit it up if you have to. God, please tell me you haven't. Has anyone? I went to the fridge and the cakes were untouched. I told him so and he sighed with relief. Told me to turn on the local news and watch. Then he hangs up the phone. I turn on the news to see a breaking story. A car had been pulled from the river that morning. It was mere yards from where we crabbed. A body was inside. The crabs hadn't gotten fat on fish. We didn't throw the cakes away. We buried them deep and said a prayer.